Okay, here we go. I think rather than progressing through the chapter the way I was initially going to do, we're just going to sort of wrap up everything that we talked about and connect the dots, sort of thing. Right after the class, a few students asked, are we going to, in this lecture, are we going to talk about anything new? No, not exactly. Everything you need to know has been covered, and or is in the textbook, one or the other. I'm going to bring up a few things that are related to points I made in class or in previous recorded lectures, just to remind you, this is a cultural studies class, despite the fact that there's a lot of names and there's a lot of dates, that remembering what the people do and the ideas that are behind, the events and the main sort of concepts of the class are much more important than memorizing dates and names. However, cultures need names. We need names to understand what things are. So to a certain extent, we have gone from, prehistoric times and just like what the British Isles looks like, its shape and its form. One of my favorite professors, Robert Buckles, makes the repeated point that geography is destiny, and the British Isles are islands, and England is the southern part of the biggest island of this group of islands, which makes it different. There's a lot of stories about that being a very important element of the identity of English people. Some of those things are true and some of them are not. We try to stay away from things that you can't prove, like the English believing that they're part of Europe or not part of Europe. That's really a matter of individual opinion. However, you can't get away from the fact that it is an island. There's a narrow gap between France and between England, and that has, for better or for worse, made a big difference in the development of the culture of Great Britain, which we call British culture now. So originally I said British culture includes Northern Ireland and Wales and Scotland and England. England is it's a very dominant part of British culture, and in this class you have seen us talk about England 90% of the time. However, the main thing that makes the British culture and Great Britain possible is the union between Scotland and England, which creates this thing called the United Kingdom of Great Britain, which is the country itself. You might see Scotland participating in rugby or in the World Cup as a separate nation, because it is a nation. The United Kingdom is, originally it was multiple kingdoms. The United Kingdom was called the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. So Ireland was never included as sort of a partner in the new nation that was created by joining Scotland. But the most important thing was Scotland was often a problem because they remained fiercely independent, and they fought against the English in several wars to remain a separate, nation state. And the French helped them as much as they could. Since France and England fought each other continuously for hundreds of years, we already went over the 100 Years' War and other things. Since that was a reality, the threat of France and Scotland from both sides, sort of squeezing England in between, was always a problem. So this is the reason why geography is destiny, because Scotland is in a position that's sort of unique, economically sort of separated and poorer, but geographically in a position to help France sort of get in the back door whenever it wants. If France could get ships up there and actually, put boots on the ground to attack England, that they did. But usually it was just economic aid and political support. So the Scots would attack from the north and the French could attack from the south at the same time. It's sort of basic military strategy is, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But anyway, this alliance went on for hundreds of years. And when this was neutralized at the very end of chapter 3, we'll kind of rewind things when we talk about America, and go back in time to when Columbus went across the ocean. But at this point, the United Kingdom starts to sort of consolidate itself and start to project power and its culture over the oceans. And France is doing the same thing. And that is really the thing that eventually they're natural enemies because they're side by side, just like France and Germany or France and Spain fought many wars because they're next to each other. But eventually it would be sort of a heavyweight title for, control of the world between France and England, which, Napoleon would win on the land and the British would win on the sea, and eventually would result in France sort of collapsing into still being an empire, but being not able to compete with the United Kingdom directly. All of this is to come later. However, these are how you connect the dots, is that Scotland is a big problem. They're a problem all the way back to the Romans. That's why there's something called the Hadrian's Wall, which is almost like a DMZ kind of thing that separates the island into the north part and the south part. And so the Romans can't handle the Scots either. Anglo-Saxons, they can't deal with it. Mostly the Vikings do take over the northern part, but they mix with the Scottish people. So they're kind of like integrated into the Scottish sort of warrior mountain people, sort of rugged, tough warrior culture. And so they take over Scotland, but they don't really turn it into a Viking country. They just sort of mix with their people in the same way that the Normans eventually just sort of get absorbed by the English and they're Anglo-Norman, and then they just become English. The Anglo-Saxons are the original Germanic people. They mix. The Jutes are the third tribe. We talked about them, but really for some reason or another, maybe because they only had one kingdom out of 7, they sort of fall off the map. The Welsh, right? You got the Irish, you got the Scottish, you got the Welsh. That's one of the students, international students, asked, like, what about Wales? Edward Longshanks, before he attacked Scotland unsuccessfully, and Scotland remained independent, he conquered Wales. So way back 800 years ago, Wales sort of became part of the English nation state. Nowadays, there is sort of like a movement to sort of, recover the Welsh country and the Welsh culture. But that's really something that started relatively recently, by which I mean like 100 years ago or so, 19th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, sort of post Spring of Nations sort of idea that all the empires collapsed. Wales remained within the territory of England. Should we be independent just like everybody else? I made some jokes about Liechtenstein, even Belgium. I took a couple shots at those states, and Switzerland even. those states kind of exist. We talked about there being like 56 states in Europe, which is an extremely high number, considering most of North America is Canada, United States, and Mexico. So it's just, when I look at a map of Europe, I'm always sort of startled by the fact that it has more countries than Africa, which I said will probably change, but that's sort of a product of 19th century Europe being dominated by like 5 empires and then ripping itself apart in World War One primarily, but then again in World War Two, and that's what we got. So the British culture is somewhat insulated by all of that. That's why I think they're kind of, it seems like they want to be, an island, and they want to be separate. There's something, they're proud of it to a certain extent. They want to be European, but they only want to have the good part of it. It's sort of an isolation, like a splendid isolation concept where they can sort of sit back and everybody can fight over Europe, and then England can be like, well, we're going to pick the winning side. This was always an advantage of the British that, bad weather happened, and I've talked about that in the Great Famine, and the plague hit and everything, but it was never, somehow it's never really, the British Isles never get the worst of it. It's Italy that gets hit the worst, or it's Germany that gets hit the worst, or France, for whatever reason, whatever it is, a revolution or a plague or really bad weather. It's just not quite as bad as everybody else. So it's like this, it's this place of moderation. So, I guess that's part of the identity of the British being sort of conservative. This is just a reminder of these major cultures that we talked about a long time ago. Another student asked me, is that on the test? And obviously it is. So don't forget that the first couple weeks we talked about these guys. Well into the third week, I think, we talked about William and the effect of the Normans on the language and the culture, and how they, Thomas Becket, Henry II, all the drama, Eleanor of Aquitaine, John, right? Prince John, who becomes King John when Richard dies, and the fact that he's such a bad king. He's so disgusting and so bad at fighting and war, and taxes people so much that they force him to sign a document which goes down in history, sort of right into the Civil War, as being the king can't do whatever he wants. It's rich people forcing him to behave like one of them, have the same rules as other wealthy upper class people, and be responsible. That's really what the Magna Carta is. They don't care about slaves or poor people, but by the time you get to the Black Death and you get to the peasants' revolts at the end of the 14th century, remember how important that is, because definitely there'll be questions related to the 14th century in England, because it's just one disaster after another. The 3 main ones are the Great Famine in 1315, which is 100 years exactly. It's not just 1 year, it's 7 years, but the worst year is supposedly 100 years after Magna Carta. And that's what you get for managing your kingdom terribly. Is just God helps them who help themselves. So he also punishes the wicked. And that's how people thought. Remember, it's a very religious society. England is the same as France and Germany and Italy. In that sense, everybody thinks that God is actually doing things actively in the society. The church is the center of the town. And when bad things happen, there's a reason for it, probably because people are bad. So the Magna Carta, on the 100th anniversary, they don't think it's a coincidence. The Glorious Revolution, 1688, It's 100 years later after the Spanish Armada is defeated, and the Catholic-led English fleet of James II gets blown away, and William III from William of Orange, William III from the Netherlands, the Dutch husband of Queen Mary, they come in without anybody really standing in their way. And it's largely a result of the wind turning against the fleet, allowing them to land an army, which the army, nobody really wants to fight them and die. The Civil War, is in the 1640s, so there's actually people alive who are like, we don't want 20% of our people to die again, especially over a Catholic king who's nobody's Catholic anymore anyway. So he just walks in and pretty much takes over the country. But most of it, they don't say it's just coincidence. They say, oh, this is the anniversary of the Spanish Armada. And it's November 5th, which is also an anniversary of stopping Catholic menace, so this belief in the Protestant wind, in that, God must be on the English side, not the Spanish or the French or the Catholics. He must be helping us out. We are the chosen people. This is an idea that takes root, throughout the 16th and 17th century, and when the United States becomes a country, before they become a country, and they're expanding and they're settling and they're landing places by accident, and the wind's blowing them this way, and that they're going to say the same thing. It's just like, America is God's country, and we're here because we're supposed to be here. This is destiny, right? The native people being devastated by disease, and us landing in this part or that part of the country and having victory here or there is because God is on our side. So, as far as democracy is concerned, Magna Carta looks like, in retrospect, looking back, it looks like the start of the limitation of the king's power, especially, as I said, when you get to the 1688, and the king in France is Louis XIV, who is just taxing the French people as much as he wants, and drafting everybody into the army, and creating a French empire without anybody really agreeing to anything that he does. He's just commanding everything as an absolute king of France. And the English kings want to be like that, but they can't. Mostly because there's too much history, there's too much culture of negotiation, and they're just basically poor. The French kings are not desperate to have the French nobility help them. And once Louis XIV gets them under control, I guess he just was able to keep that control, and he lived a long time, and he was the king of France for 72 years. So that helps. Like, you don't have to worry about kings dying suddenly. I mentioned that before. People getting tired of taxes and dying. Doesn't matter. If Henry VIII lives for 72 years, more damage is going to be done. I'm not saying Louis XIV is a better king than Henry VIII, but if you are the king and you don't have to hand over power to your son or your cousin or your nephew, like Queen Elizabeth, this just creates a little bit more stability and continuity, which France has and England doesn't. So the Civil War in the 17th century, the 1640s, the Civil War is the big event. Like I said, you got to look at Locke and how, his influence of philosophy about, all people being sort of neutral or innocent when they're born, and then they grow up, and then you can affect people with the environment. If you create a society that's good and balanced, then, republics and democracies are going to work. I think we all know that he was mistaken a little bit, that people as a group sometimes make terrible decisions. But that's really not a mistake on his part. He's just saying that we can make people educated, and we can make people good, and we can let people participate in government and make good decisions. We don't have to treat people like animals who are dangerous and they're always going to be selfish and attack each other, like Thomas Hobbes says. So we don't need somebody like Oliver Cromwell to be a military, political, religious force who just strictly controls society. We can have democracy, we can vote, and we can have groups of people represent us. John Locke believes that. He tries to do that later in the colonies, and his social experiments mostly fail. But he didn't have a lot of technology or sort of scientific knowledge to go on, or experimental, evidence to point him in the right direction. He's really like an old-fashioned philosopher. And Isaac Newton too. It's like he's inventing calculus. He's inventing ways to describe gravity. Science doesn't really exist. So, I mean, these guys are creating. They're just, I don't know what their IQs were or how smart they are. But Isaac Newton is, I think, way up there with Da Vinci and Einstein and everybody else, simply because he was playing with light and calculus and gravity, and just through the power of his own mind was able to describe them scientifically using mathematics. Still was a religious person, and still apparently went to church and believed in God and everything else, and still, worked. I mean, I guess he thought that mathematics was sort of a way to describe how God designed things. I think that's, Benjamin Franklin was like that too. We'll talk about him later in the course. So, I mean, this is the big picture kind of thing. There's a lot of things to know. You don't need to know everything. The headings in the chapters, of course, pay attention to them. Anything I mentioned, put on the board. You have to try and be able to understand it and express it. I know English is not your first language, any of you. So I have had a few Americans in my class, but they weren't, they were not A+ students. Koreans beat them, and other international students beat them. So there's no reason why you can't do well on this test, despite the fact that English is not your first language. So I wish you all the best on Friday. We will do this test at 11. I think the last thing I just want to note is just take a look at the Scottish part at the end of the chapter 3. Because I only mentioned sort of the restoration in passing, but I linked a few things together: Queen Victoria, the language, the food, the dress, the bagpipes, the music of the Scots. They definitely had a very big impact on the development of the British culture that we know today. But as I said, for us, probably the fact that they've resisted for so long, and that when they joined the English, that the British sort of had a free hand to go after the Irish and to expand overseas, that really Scotland being on their team rather than being a potential, threat whenever they were trying to do something politically or militarily or economically, probably was the biggest thing that the biggest effect they had on the future of world culture, of the universe, of the globe, of the world. Another thing about the Scottish, though, religious, definitely. Some of them remain Catholic, but the urban centers become Presbyterian, join the Church of Scotland, and they educate themselves primarily to be able to read the Bible in English. So they become one of the earliest societies to be highly literate. And this results in a lot of inventors, engineers, educated people. This is they have an abnormal number of people that are famous in sort of developing scientific fields. This is not because Scottish people are smarter than the average people. I think it's because the culture becomes so educated and so literate even faster than England does. And then they have the opportunity to go and study and use when the British culture develops, they have the opportunity to use the resources of England too. Okay, so take a look at the Scottish part, because we won't talk about Scotland too much from now on. So, and they are important, so make sure you read that part at the end of the chapter, and see you on Friday at 11. Good luck to everyone.